Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Arshi Siddiqui, a former top policy aide to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and currently a partner at the law firm of Akin, Gump. We'll be talking about what the midterm elections mean for tax policy this year and next. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Arshi Siddiqui, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have the discussion. There's a lot going on in Washington.
Great, for sure, absolutely. So let's take this in sort of chronological order. Congress is just beginning its annual end of the year sprint. In a month or less, it has to pass a spending bill to keep the government open. Democrats and some Senate Republicans are anxious to approve an election reform bill. And there are several tax bills on the table, which we'll be talking about. They include a retirement savings bill, a fistful of expired or expiring business tax provisions from the TCJA, and efforts to restore a more generous child tax credit. So let's start with a retirement savings bill. Do you think they can get a deal done this year on that bill?
So I think, lame duck sessions are often really guided by two principles in my mind, just based on experience over the years, both on the Hill and now that I've left in the past 11 years. And basically it's this, it's election results and then also member mood. And that member mood coupled with election results, I think then kind of translates into political will. If there is anything that has political will surrounding it as a legislative measure, I think it is the retirement package. I think it's bipartisan, bicameral. I think there is a lot of effort, work, intensity to try to get that over the finish line. And so if you're, focused on that piece of legislation, I think absolutely there's a path, and probably a decent path, but there are a lot of different other things swirling out in the ether. And certainly the piece of legislation still is going to be impacted by the rest of the agenda.
I guess I should ask, as a general matter, do you think that any bill passes a freestanding legislation at this point, or does everything just get added on to an omnibus at the end of the year?
So my experience on that packaging piece, there's always a lot of questions on vehicles, and we obviously I would put it in a few different categories. So the first and foremost is there going to be an omnibus, or is there going to be a continuing resolution? If there's going to be a continuing resolution, that path, I think, makes it a lot harder for other pieces to ride on if they're not in the extension kind of and straight, clean extension kind of category. So that's one. Two, if we're looking at an omnibus, and I think there are a lot of people in Washington and on and off the Hill who would hope that would be the case. If that's the case, then I think what happens is they continue to negotiate the omnibus, they continue to negotiate these other pieces. They're either put in together or they're separated in a strategic way. And that is usually a process that the leadership goes through to figure out how to maximize votes and how to expedite, bills. So I think that's an open question. The real question, I think the first major next touch point is getting top line numbers on appropriations. And we're still waiting for those.
And while everybody has been fixated on December 16th, I assume that that's not the real date. The real date is sometime later in December.
Yes, unfortunately for all of us, I think that is probably the case. I think that there has been a concerted effort to say, if we say the 16th, then we probably go into the next week. 23rd is the Friday before Christmas. I will say that the top line numbers need to be figured out in fairly short order because there's a little bit of a lag time there, but it feels like in terms of the way I'm making my plans, I'm planning to be here that week.
And what about the week after?
I think, the week after, if they cannot get it done, I think things can often kind of bleed into the weekend. But then you're looking into squarely into Christmas. Then I think they have to have a contingency plan of some sort of short-term kind of approach and then go into next year. So it's possible. We've seen it in other prior years to go kind of, come back after Christmas, but then that probably means that they leave, that people celebrate Christmas and then they're back kind of post-Christmas, which that week, I think generally folks try to avoid being in Washington.
Got it. So let's talk about the other big issue, or actually perhaps pair of issues. And one of these expiring business provisions and the child credit. Republicans and some Democrats clearly want to do something about these expiring business provisions. Progressive Democrats particularly really want to do something about the child credit. Particularly, they want to do something about full refundability. At this point, can you see those two agendas getting married? And if they do, what does the child credit deal look like?
It's been interesting because I've heard that same vein of our discussion / argument on the child tax credit in terms of it being so disproportionately larger than the business provisions in play. And for me, it feels like that's a little bit of a disingenuous frame. And the reason I say that is that, as we all know, every tax provision is dialable in some way, right? Whether it's extension, length of extension, whether it's amount. I mean, there's so many different ways to slice and dice these things. So for me, these types of negotiations always come back to political will. If there is political will, they will find a path forward that is roughly on par in terms of revenue with what we're seeing on the business side. One. Two, I think on the child tax credit, I mean, it has been historically a bipartisan provision. So this is not the most difficult needle to thread, but if the negotiating frame is that, listen, you support these business provisions as well, and we don't want absolutely anything on the individual side, then I think that's going to be a difficult path forward for Democrats. And the other piece I would actually also raise is the child tax credit. I characterize it less about being a progressive, a part of the progressive kind of agenda. I think it's caucus wide. I think Democrats generally want to make sure that working families, are kind of who are dealing with inflation and other challenges, that there is some piece of this package that addresses that reality.
So we had George Callis on a couple of weeks ago, of course, from a Republican background. And George was saying that he thought that Republicans would be interested in a deal on child credit, except for full refundability, which he thought was a non-starter for them. Do you agree with him?
I actually think there is going to be a discussion. I think absolutely. So so it's the question, do I agree with him on full refundability, or do I think that there's going to be a deal?
Either way.
Okay.
You can answer them both.
Okay, I will answer them both. I am still fairly optimistic on a lame duck tax package, but I would say my optimism has been dampened a little bit in recent days. If Senator Warnock does win the runoff, I actually do think that increases the possibilities of a lame duck package. And I would defer to George in some ways, in the sense that I think the Democrats are ready to negotiate. I think there's political will both on Senator Schumer's side, Speaker Pelosi's side, and also chairs Wyden and Neal. So I think that political will is there. I think the Republicans have to make a calculus. I think it's an easier calculus if Warnock wins and there's a little bit more clarity on that. But I do think also the mood coming back into Washington, it's been a little bit mixed. There's a lot of swirl out there. So my answer on this is I'm still cautiously optimistic that we can get to a tax package. And then two, on the child tax credit, on refundability, I think if they get to a point where they want to cut a deal, they will cut a deal. I mean, I think this is not a difficult negotiation on the child tax credit. They'll get there. Mm-hmm. But it all leads back to political will. So
the other issue for the lame duck that we haven't talked about yet is a debt limit bill. Some talk among Democrats about getting that out of the way now for the next couple of years. What do you think? Is there a chance that they can pull that off?
I would say I rarely give resolute answers given, the nature of our business, but I would say I think the chances of a debt limit deal in lame duck are next to zero, for so many different reasons. I do know that the administration explored it at one point. I do know in a perfect world, would Democrats want to take that off the table? Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a strong record on the Democratic side to making sure that we do whatever we can to protect the whole notion of full faith and credit. At the same time, there are a lot of moving parts on the Republican side, and on a bipartisan basis, we've found that unless there is a looming deadline, it is difficult for Congress to tee up and get all their ducks in a row. So I think from that perspective, the debt limit continues to come up in conversations that I have with members and senior staff. But at the same time, when you look at all of the other things that folks are thinking about, there are some pressing issues that still need to be resolved.
So if the debt limit is not addressed this year, is it going to be as ugly as conventional wisdom suggests next year?
I think it is. I think it is going to be ugly, and for two reasons. One is I think that the political climate has shifted on both parties. So I think for Democrats, we saw President Obama do this a little bit as well, where he was much more, we've seen in the past that where Democrats often, I don't want to say cave, but they often are very cognizant of real world consequences and take that responsibility very seriously. So, an example of that is that during the financial crisis, there was an informal agreement between Speaker Pelosi and John Boehner about the Democratic caucus and then the Republican conference, basically kind of bringing up half of the votes on each side to pass TARP. Right. And what we found is that at one point that the Republicans revolted for a lot of different reasons, through no fault of Speaker Boehner's, but at the time, Leader Boehner's, but at the time, then Speaker Pelosi had to go back and basically convince a bunch of progressives to vote for TARP, which they really didn't want to do. I think that kind of frame of how Democrats deal with these types of issues, I think that's now dated. And I think one kind of big turning point, which I don't think is fully appreciated, is I do think that January 6th really did shift something on the Democratic side in terms of, in many members of Congress have some level of PTSD from that day. So I think, long way of saying that I think when we look at this discussion on debt limit, obviously on the Republican side, there are some folks who definitely want to take hostages. And I think on the Democratic side, I think there are Democrats who will say, we're not going to negotiate with a gun to our head.
It was interesting. George had said that, he hears from investors, well, this always happens and they always make a deal and no reason to worry about it. And he was saying that he was warning people to not be quite so sanguine about this next year.
Yeah, I think particularly if Republicans think that Democrats are going to cave because quote unquote cave, I think there is going to have to be. I think it is potentially going to be problematic. Now that said, I will say I will be happy to be wrong. I usually don't say that, but if we go through this process in a smooth way, I think it's good for the economy. It's good for the country. So I hope to be wrong on that count.
I hope you're wrong too. I'm not looking forward to it. I'll tell you. So a broad question about next year. Do you see any serious tax legislation, fiscal legislation next year, or is it really just going to be message bills and investigations really in both chambers?
So I think a lot depends on the lame duck, right? If we have a robust lame duck, then I think that and on retirement and on tax, and I think that really dampens the outlook for next year. I mean, I think when I look at next year and in terms of the election results and how that all plays out, a couple things is one is it really is the must pass, must do expirations that are going to drive the agenda. number one.
Mhm.
And I think it will be hard. I think we will have an early start to the presidential on both sides for different reasons, but still both sides will be having conversations about what that looks like. And then two, I think the other model for legislation is similar to what we saw on the infrastructure package, where you had a group of moderate Republicans and Democrats coming together. That's not a great model on tax policy. It's just not generally how tax policy is put together. So from that perspective, I go back to must pass. And if it must pass, there are kind of thoughts on what does that debt, that debt limit piece look like. And I don't think we know fully yet. I think on the Democratic side, the starting position will be clean extension. And then two is if we have a bunch of expired provisions, then I think that's the vehicle.
So Republicans during the campaign talked about two big tax priorities. One of them was making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, and the other is repealing the $80 billion in IRS funding that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So let's take them in order. The TCJA, I mean, there's no chance that it's going to be made permanent. Do you think the House Republicans would just go ahead and vote to do it anyway, even though it's going to die in the Senate?
Well, I think on the permanency, meaning across the board.
Well, on the individual.
Everything that's because other expirations don't happen for a while. It's 2025, correct?
Right, correct. That's right. Pretty much all the individual provisions expire in 2025. Other than these few corporate things that we were talking about.
Oh, yeah. So you're talking about as we get into 25, but not.
No, I'm talking about next year. I'm talking about
next year.
2023. It's kind of an odd question, even.
Yes.
Would Republicans try to extend in 2023 a law that doesn't expire until 2025, which seems like a very un-Congress-like thing to do in any event?
It's an interesting question to ask, because I think the other piece of this is that the Republicans are going to have a hard time building out an agenda. I mean, I know they have kind of released various policy proposals over the last, maybe 3 to 4 months, but this margin is significant in terms of how it impacts the House agenda. I've been doing a lot of these discussions / panels / presentations, and when I have Republican colleagues doing them with me, it's very interesting because without fail, the data point that's used is, well, this is a similar margin as it was with Speaker Pelosi. And it's just not a night and day comparison for so many different reasons. And just to kind of flesh that out a little bit more, is it's different because I think Democrats by definition, they're very passionate about their positions in the party, and it's usually on major issues. It is a knockout, drag out fight. But at the same time, there's enough of a shared values and approach to policy that folks are able to come together at the end of the day because they want to get something done. And that's just core to the Democratic caucus. Generally, I mean, we have a few, both parties have their folks who are much more ideological, but generally that you can count on that on the Democratic side. And then honestly, you also have, in modern day times, Speaker Pelosi, I mean, that is her sweet spot. She knows how to count votes and she knows how to get legislation passed. So I think on the Republican side, they are going to be struggling for what to put on the floor with this narrow margin. They are going to have to figure out what their approach is going to be with Democrats. It will be challenging from the perspective of not only are the Democrats on the cusp of taking back the House, from their perspective at least, in next cycle, but had redistricting and had some different decisions been made in New York, they would still have the majority. So that, I think, makes it much harder for the Republicans to peel off Democrats. It would have been much easier for them to peel off Democrats if the margin was more significant. And honestly, the seats that Democrats need to win back, they're in Biden districts. Mm-hmm. So all of that to say that I actually think it's an insightful question, because if you look at what Republicans can really bring to the floor, I mean, TCGA has been fairly resilient, and I think it is core to the Republican Party in terms of their approach. So I don't foreclose it. I think also the other thing I would say for the group is I think Democrats have been very responsible in the way they approach TCJA. They haven't politicized it. They have looked at every provision on the merits. R&D amortization is a good example. So I think there's something to be said. I think I wouldn't be surprised. And my last point I would make is, if you look at how many ACA repeal votes we had, it does feel like this is in that same kind of family of maybe this makes sense.
So the other one is the IRS funding. And of course, Republicans have been very aggressive at talking about how they want to get rid of the $80 billion. Not so easy to get rid of the $80 billion, but there's still going to be an IRS appropriations bill, and they can sort of take the money out of one pocket if they can't get it out of another. Do you think that Republicans are going to make a full-blown effort to cut back on IRS funding? And the other question is, how far are Democrats going to be willing to go to preserve that funding? I mean, after all, money for the IRS is not exactly the most popular thing that any politician can support.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 points here. Is that one is has to do on the broader investigations agenda. So I think, the House, we're in uncharted territory in terms of the House of Representatives. And the reason I say that is that this type of margin and the political climate is going to make it extremely difficult to navigate anything in the House. So that makes the whole notion of the House being a winner take all system really kind of center on 2 things. Is one is that Republicans will have chairmanships, or they'll have chairs that they can really set the agenda. And then and that does lead to this whole notion of what type of oversight will they pursue. So I think that, that will set the tone for Democrats as well, and the administration, in terms of how they respond and how they proceed. On the IRS specifically, I think a lot of that also depends on the administration. I think if they can proceed in a way where there aren't big dust-ups, there aren't kind of great graphic examples for the Republicans to seize upon, then I think that makes their job much more difficult. Because I think, when you look at the IRS itself, take all the politics outside of it, it's crumbling in every level. When you look at the technology, when you look at, this is a major piece. You're talking about individual and family taxpayer money, where folks really can't even engage with the IRS in a real way. So I think that there is a way to depoliticize this. Do I think that that's going to happen? I hope it does at some level. But I think, to your point, I think it's an easy messaging point. And so I think, it all depends on how does the IRS piece fit into the larger investigations piece. Maybe they have better fodder and more high profile fodder. But I fully anticipate that this IRS funding piece will not go away.
So another question about next year. You talked about must pass bills earlier. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the US falls into a recession early next year. Do you see any chance of some sort of a bipartisan tax cut bill in response to a slowing economy or even a recession?
It's a great question, because when I was on the Hill, those and kind of policymakers dealt with this exact same fact pattern. Your kind of go-to tools are not really there. And so I think that creates real challenges for Congress in terms of what they do and how they deal with it, because inflation certainly is a big overhang as well. And we certainly saw what happened in Britain. Now you can have different schools of thought on why that went the way it did, but it is an interesting kind of dynamic to put out there. So I think policymakers will have to grapple with what those policies look like, and the tried and true pieces that they've used in the past are not at their disposal in the same way. Certainly, I think deficits will start rearing their head a little bit in terms of concerns. I mean, when you look at the amount of money that the government has spent during this COVID era, it's significant. There are a lot of investments that still need to get out the door. So all of those things lend to, I think, a much more challenging role for Congress, because once you take out messaging, then what is left in terms of really the tools that policymakers can use? So to answer your question directly, I think it depends on the depth of the recession. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about a dark, stormy economic outlook for a while. It hasn't truly materialized. We certainly have seen some real challenges with inflation, but that whole recession piece truly hasn't materialized yet. And when that happens, I think Congress will be at a point where there will be pressure to do something.
So now that I've asked you to talk about what's going to happen in 2023, I'm going to press my luck and ask you what's going to happen in 2024.
Okay.
So President Trump has already, former President Trump has already announced he's running for re-election. President Biden has more or less dropped hints, but without really coming up with a final decision. Question is there going to be a serious tax policy debate in 2024? Or does the fact that Trump is running simply suck all the oxygen out of a policy debate, and the whole thing just turns into Trump or no Trump?
You know, I think the overall political climate is so critical, because when you look at, when we looked into the midterms, and you look at what every pundit, every pundit and pollster, they didn't quite get it right. And when you talk to them, and there was a big disconnect between what would happen when you saw that coverage versus when you talk to members as they were running their campaigns on the ground. So I think, you know, I kind of look at this last election as a little bit of a cocktail, or maybe a salad bowl, in the sense that the way Democrats did so well is that they obviously had strong candidates, but they also hyper focused on, you know, tailoring their campaigns to what was on the ground. And that was a whole mix. So that was kind of Dobbs, it was inflation, it was democracy. There were all these different kind of pieces in each race in each state. So I would say that on that piece, it's a lot of this is going to depend on where the country is. And honestly, I think there's also going to be a big kind of discussion, you know, on the DeSantis piece. I think that changes the dynamic in a big way. And my guess is he will bring up taxes, given what he's done in Florida.
Mm-hmm. We just a couple of minutes left, and I before we go, I have to ask you about Nancy Pelosi. You worked for her for quite a while. What do the Democrats lose when Nancy Pelosi steps away? How do things change for them?
So, you know, the speaker, her real legacy, and I think where she doesn't get enough credit, was her pragmatism. And so she was really able to pull together the caucus in a way, and because of her negotiating skills, and she very rarely faced instances where, in fact, that the caucus would not back her. So much so that, you know, when you look at kind of her relationship with both President Obama and President Biden, I mean, she's delivered in huge ways. So I think they're all of that, that ability and that institutional knowledge. But I think it's also important to note that when she started, she was an appropriator, and she certainly had a strong background there. But a lot of these legislative issues, she really did do the deep dive once she got to leadership. And of course, she was on the Intel committee, so she had a strong grasp there in terms of her leadership there. But so I think what this all translates into in this new era is, I do think that there's going to be a bit of a learning curve. There are going to be, I think there's going to be more involvement by the chairs of each committee, or the ranking members. And I think also there's going to be a vigorous and intense discussion amongst the caucus as folks try to position themselves, because there's going to be a vacuum. There's no way around it. No matter who, I'm a huge fan of Hakeem Jeffries, longtime supporter. So, but no matter who entered this, that there would be a vacuum at some level. Now, that said, I will say about Congressman Jeffries, Leader Jeffries, or Leader to be Jeffries, I guess. He also brings something new to the table, which is critical. I think there has been for a long time, there has been this sense that the need to turn the page in terms of a new generation of leaders. And he has done a lot of work to position himself for this moment. So from that perspective, I think, taking a look at things, that worked is going to be very important, but also putting a new stamp on this new generation. I think we're going to see that. And I think that's great for the Democratic caucus.
Great, terrific. Well, actually, thank you so much. We are out of time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and looking forward to a very interesting year.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.